It began like a slow burn, a spark I didn't even realize was happening until the fire was already out of control. I had always known my husband, Mark, was ambitious. He had big dreams, a work ethic that left me in awe, and an almost obsessive drive to climb the corporate ladder. He worked in a competitive field, and his boss, Stephen, was a well-respected figure in the industry, powerful, confident, and a man who exuded authority. At first, Stephen's presence seemed almost intimidating to me, and I stayed out of his way during the few occasions I'd seen him at company events or gatherings. But that all changed one evening when I attended a work dinner with Mark. Stephen had invited us, and though I was initially hesitant about spending an evening with the higher-ups, Mark convinced me to come. The dinner took place at a fancy restaurant, a place where I felt out of place but did my best to blend in. Stephen was the life of the table, effortlessly commanding the attention of everyone around him. I had always admired his charisma, but that night something shifted. As the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, Stephen and I found ourselves in conversation. Mark, engrossed in talking business with other colleagues, didn't seem to notice how Stephen and I gravitated towards each other. Stephen spoke about his own family, his childhood, his experiences of climbing the corporate ladder, and for the first time I saw a vulnerability in him. He was no longer just Mark's boss, he was a man who had faced struggles and triumphs, and the more he spoke, the more I found myself drawn to him. It felt like he understood me in ways Mark never did. We talked long after the others had drifted off to other conversations. At some point, I realized that we were alone at the table, the restaurant emptying around us. Stephen's gaze lingered on me, his expression turning more serious. "You're an incredible woman, Lauren," he said, his voice low and sincere. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me was flattered, part of me was terrified. I glanced at Mark from across the room, and for a fleeting moment I saw him laugh and joke with his colleagues, completely oblivious to the conversation happening between his boss and me. Stephen's hand brushed mine as he stood to leave, his touch electric. My heart raced, but I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The next few weeks passed, but my thoughts were consumed by that night. We exchanged a few more casual conversations at work events, and I noticed how Stephen's presence seemed to grow more intense each time. His smile lingered a little longer when we spoke. He would find reasons to check in on me, to make sure I was doing okay, even outside of business-related conversations. At the time, I told myself it was harmless. But that was the lie I kept telling myself, over and over again. I was still in love with Mark, I reasoned. I wasn't going to let anything happen. But the emotional pull was undeniable. And then, one night, Stephen texted me. It was a simple message at first: "You looked beautiful tonight at the event. Let's grab coffee sometime and talk." I'd been thinking about our conversation. I stared at the message for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Coffee was innocent enough, right? It wasn't like he had asked to meet in private or for anything inappropriate. But I knew deep down this was crossing a line. I replied, agreeing to meet him the next afternoon. We sat at a small cafe, and as soon as he sat across from me, I could feel the air between us shift. He leaned forward, and his eyes held an intensity that made my heart race. "Lauren, I can't stop thinking about you. There's something between us, and I don't think we can ignore it anymore." I felt trapped. Part of me wanted to pull away, to remind myself of Mark, but another part of me was overwhelmed by the connection that had been building since that first dinner. I didn't know how to explain it, but when Stephen looked at me like that, it felt like he truly saw me, really saw me in a way that no one else had. My marriage with Mark had become routine, filled with unspoken frustrations and misunderstandings. But with Stephen, I felt desired, understood, and for the first time in a long time, truly seen. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and secret conversations. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but at the same time, the emotions I felt when I was with Stephen were intoxicating. I would tell myself that it wasn't a full affair, that it wasn't something I could allow to go too far, but every time I saw him, every time we exchanged a touch or shared a private look, I couldn't stop myself from craving more. Then came the night that would change everything. Mark had been working late, as usual. He was the kind of guy who would sacrifice time with me for work, and though I had tried to be understanding, I found myself growing resentful. Stephen had suggested we meet at a hotel bar just to talk, he'd said. But we both knew the moment we met there that it wasn't just talk. That night, everything crossed a line. We kissed for the first time, and I could feel my world spinning around me. I knew this was wrong, that it was a betrayal of the highest order. But in that moment, I didn't care. I didn't think about Mark, about the consequences, about the shattered trust. I just focused on the way Stephen made me feel, the passion that had been building between us for weeks. It felt like everything I had been missing in my marriage. When I returned home that night, I barely recognized myself. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I stared at Mark as he sat on the couch, completely unaware of the storm that had just torn through my world. I hated myself, but at the same time I couldn't stop thinking about Stephen. The affair continued for months. It was like living in two separate worlds. With Mark, I was the dutiful wife, playing the role of the supportive partner, while with Stephen, I was something else entirely desired, powerful and free. But it wasn't sustainable. The lies piled up. The constant balancing act was exhausting, and every stolen moment with Stephen only deepened my guilt. Eventually, Mark found out. He had always been a smart man, and I couldn't hide my emotions from him forever. One evening, he confronted me, and the truth spilled out in a torrent of shame and regret. His heart was broken, but his anger was something I could never have prepared for. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to face, watching Mark's pain, knowing I had caused it. I had betrayed the person I had promised to love and cherish, and in return, I had received the hollow victory of emotional validation from someone else. The affair ended immediately after that confrontation, but the damage was done. Mark and I separated for a time. Our relationship irreparably changed. Looking back, I realized that my affair wasn't just about Stephen. It was about something I was missing in my marriage: emotional connection, intimacy, and validation. I had let my own insecurities cloud my judgment, thinking that a new relationship could fix what was broken inside me. But all it did was create more pain for everyone involved. Mark and I worked through our issues. We went to therapy, and slowly, we rebuilt what had been lost. But the scar of that affair remained, both in our marriage and in my heart. I learned that infidelity isn't just about the physical betrayal, it's about the emotional disconnect that leads you to seek something outside of your relationship. And when that disconnect is there, it's much harder to ignore the temptation, no matter how deep the love runs. I will never forget the lessons I learned during that time, lessons about trust, self-worth, and the importance of communication. And while my relationship with Stephen ended, as it should have, the emotional fallout from the affair will be something I carry with me forever.